Welcome to the Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett, where you plus this podcast equals better decisions. I'm Alena Bennett, speaker, author, and leadership expert. I work with chief executive officers and chief financial officers to help them create universally investable companies where people serve people and the math just works. This week, I'm talking to the incredible Yvonne Hilsz, award-winning sales and leadership strategist. But first, here's my what I'm noticing at the moment, or Win ATM, to help you win at the moment. So what I'm noticing at the moment is there are lots of people at inflection points in their career. They might be in new roles. They might have just had a breakthrough in their current role. They might have shifts in their board or at the CEO leadership level, or the company might be at an inflection point. So I think what I'm seeing across the board is that many of us are at a moment of exposure. This is when we're tested. It's a sink or swim moment. And I think what I'm seeing, and certainly this is my experience as well, is that opportunity is really exciting, but it can also be really daunting or scary because of the pressure not to waste the opportunity. And I know for all you high performers and high achievements out there, we're always thinking, how do I take advantage of this opportunity? How do I make sure I don't miss the opportunity? There's that whole FOMO culture out there, certainly at the moment, at work and outside work. But I think what is most daunting about being at an inflection point and kind of, I described it to a client yesterday who made the really bold admission, but you could kind of see the fear in her eyes a little bit. She sort of said, we'd done this reflection exercise, and she said, Alena, I'm here. She said, I've done what I set out to do. And she goes, I'm a little bit scared of what's next because I'm scared about what could happen and what might work well and what might not go well. And I think what's daunting about that, it's a little bit like that great mountain analogy where you climb up the first mountain and you're kind of thinking, oh, this is so hard. This is my goal, just to get to the top of the mountain. Then, of course, as we all know, you get to the top of that mountain, you look out and go, bugger, there's other mountains to conquer around. I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, are we up for it? And actually, even deeper than that, do we want it? And I think what I have noticed that separates those from those people that take advantage of those opportunities or maximize and optimize those opportunities between those and those that don't are those that are willing to put themselves in a situation where you may get to that next inflection point. So, if I think about the client I was working with yesterday, she has put herself in scenarios. She's sat in groups of people that have allowed her to do the work to get to where she's at. And so without that support, she might not be there. And so it's really about, I guess that's just an example of that common saying, you've got to get yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think the thought-provoking question I want to leave you with here today is not that ground earth-shattering, to be perfectly honest. It's, what do you want? And perhaps I'll extend that just to make it a little harder or practical, is what do you want enough that you're willing to put yourself in a potentially uncomfortable situation or new environment? And that might be you individually, like my client yesterday, or it might be your company. I've just finished reading Dr. Benjamin Hardy's The Science of Scaling, and it's about how businesses have transformed themselves rapidly by creating such impossible goals that it forces themselves to do things radically different. It forces them to throw out the old rule books, to throw out this is the way we've always done things, and approach things so differently. So when I ask you what do you want, I want you to hear that through a personal lens. What do you want personally, as a person, as a leader, but also as an at an organizational level. If you are sitting in the C-suite role, in the CEO role, or even in the board role, what do you want for your company? And what do you want enough that you're willing to put yourself in an uncomfortable, unfamiliar situation or environment such that you can get to that next mountain? So with that, on to our chat with Yvonne Hilsz. It is an absolute delight to welcome my guest today, good friend, master sales coach, Yvonne Hilsz. Welcome, Yvonne. Let me just do a little humble bragging for you to start with. Yvonne Hilsz helps sales leaders build teams that drive consistent revenue by increasing conversions and confidence without the need to micromanage. Known for her practical, no-fluff approach, Yvonne has worked with powerhouse brands like Woolworths, Toyota, BWS, and Reebok to shift sales cultures, sharpen leadership impact, and create real momentum in performance. With 2 International Stevie Awards under her belt, silver for Women in Business Training Services and bronze for Mentor Coach of the Year, Yvonne brings both credibility and cut through to every room she is. What I love about Yvonne, in addition to her energy, is her frameworks are actionable. So I'm really pumped to have this conversation because I know everyone will get a huge amount of value out of it. We're in for an energizing conversation. And look, when she shares some of the results she's delivered for her clients, it'll be a no-brainer why I'm talking with her today. Yvonne, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to this. You and I always have lots to talk about.
We sure do. What I'd like to start with, though, is I want to have a real money conversation. The word math is in the title of the podcast, the real math of business. And, I think there is such an important duality between the math side and the people side of the equation. But you, day in and day out, train, mentor, coach, speak to the money in people, like the money makers, the rainmakers. Tell me a little bit, just to kind of start really broad and general, just tell me a little bit, what do we need to know about the money inside of the equation?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think the big thing for me is when I'm looking at a team, I'm assessing them for their skills. Do they know how to do the job? Do they know what the product is, which often that's they do. Where I focus them is the real skills of, how they engaging with their customers, how they looking for the value proposition in their product to be able to then share that and through understanding their customers. Often, but I'm also curious to the mindset of the person. When I deal with top sales teams and the top performers within a team, there's such a distinction between them and the rest of the group. Yes, it's often they've got tenure, they've been in the business or they've been in the industry for a long time or selling, but they approach selling very differently to those who aren't as successful. Now, sometimes they're not successful because they're new in the business, but when I look at the top 1% or that top tier, they approach sales expecting a yes. They are expecting a yes from the customer, and they're surprised when they get the no. And it's such a vast different approach to the bulk of the other team, where they approach the sale expecting a no, and then they're surprised by the yes. And it took me a while to figure that out. And I must have heard it when I did a lot of call centers about 12 years ago. I was working for Seller Masters as I entered into the whole Woolworths arena, and it is a huge arena. And there was a call center there. We had about 200 in the outbound team, maybe about 60 in the inbound team. And I really started to fine tune the craft of teaching people how to sell, because I was training tens of thousands of people within over about a 7-year period. And in a call center, you got high turnover and you're listening to bulk volume of calls. So you get good at your craft really quick, both from the sales team's perspective, but also for me as a sales trainer. And I worked with Seller Masters for about 7 years. I've heard a lot of people sell a lot of wine. And that's when I really started to listen to, and I'd hear the difference between the really great teams. I'm like, talk to me about when you're approaching into a call, like, what are you expecting? And the top performers go, I'm expecting the sale. And they're like, and we're surprised when we don't get the sale. And then I asked the same for the teams, the other teams, and a lot of them, I could hear it in their voice. They're bracing themselves for impact of a no. And when they'd get a yes, I'd often hear them go, oh, as if to say, what? And then they'd scramble going, oh my God, I wasn't prepared for the yes. I don't know how to close the sale now. And that was such an eye-opening experience for me. And I've seen this now in all I work in such broad industries, and it's still the same. And that's a lot of what I work on when I'm teaching both skills, is looking at that belief and helping them really lift up that self-belief and start to expect the yes. They go in just as prepared. In fact, they're super prepared, even if they're expecting a yes. They know their product, but it's like, well, the conversation is really to make sure that's a good fit from what we've got to what you want. And then I'm just going to button this up and move us forward. It's not this big show and, song and dance and, I've got a really get them across the line. It's like the line's already done. We've already done that. It's less transactional. It's a lot more relationship oriented. But yeah, it was such an eye-opening experience when I was like, that is a game changer.
That's so fascinating, and I have so many follow-up questions already, but I might just pull it up straight away, because from what I'm hearing, like, you've trained and coached thousands of people, tens of
Hundreds of
thousands,
thousands, actually.
hundreds of, okay,
Some of
hundreds
these
of
large
thousands.
organizations.
It sounds to me like if you're an exceptional salesperson, you have probably been trained by Yvonne. This is what I'm getting. But the thing that sets them apart from the rest is they expect a yes. So if I just go up to the 10,000 feet now and I go, well, if I'm expecting a yes, my guess is they're likely to be successful, because if they expect a yes, the results validate the yes. They're making the money for the business. When we look at the real math of business at that high level and we go, well, we just want the math to work. How does that, at the I'm selling a bottle of wine, how does that then translate up or scale up to the mindset of the sales director or the chief revenue officer, or, I'm curious about how that mindset works its way up through the hierarchy of an organization.
Yeah, it's interesting because I share that with all the leaders that I work with, and some of them haven't recognized that. Also, because they're not often doing the function of what I'm doing when I go into an organization. They're juggling a lot of other things where I focus and hyper focus in on the percentage, of that thing. And for a lot of them, they haven't recognized it. And when I tell them that's what I often am hearing and am seeing, it also allows them to adapt their coaching. So a lot of the time they're not customizing their coaching. They either ignore the top performers because they're not the squeaky wheel in the organization. They also ignore them, not often intentionally. And I literally was talking about this last week with a huge team that I was training, saying because often the top performers are better at what they do than what the leaders or the managers were if they've come through the transition of coming off the phones or coming off selling.
Yeah.
So the leaders or the managers go, oh, they're so good. I don't know what I could do to add value. So they leave them because they're high performers. But when I talk about, and there's a whole piece there around, why not to do that, because they're your rainmakers, as you said in the opening piece. But when I start to give them that lens to look through, it also has them filter differently than how to support the teams that they want to have coming up. In all organization, there's 4 types of performance types. You've got your underperformers, where often one of the strategies with good HR policies is to release them from the business. But obviously we do want to try and elevate them into becoming at least what I call a solid performer, to then become a great performer, to become a high performer. But when we look through the lens of what makes that high performer different to the other 3 performance types, it is the mindset. Yes, they had the skills, but I think the mindset is where they start to really shift gears quite differently from the others, because I can give the same skill set or the same script to any of those other 3 categories, but unless they're looking through the lens of I'm expecting a yes, they're never going to create the same results. And so that for me becomes the conversation then with the leadership team or the management team to go, if you want to elevate your performance, yes, start with skills. I always start with skills. That's one of the foundations. But you got to look at the self-belief and what is that person thinking and believing about themselves, because that's going to be how they show up in the call or in the conversation with the customer. And that then creates a whole different conversation from the leadership point of view. And that's why we get different results. Like that high performing team, which is usually about 8 to 10% of any given team, unless they're an exceptional team of high performers. The bulk of the teams sit in great performers, which is usually about 30 to 35%. Solid performers make up about the same 35 to 40%. And then hopefully you've got no more than 5% as underperformers. But underperformers, there's reasons why people are underperforming. Either they're brand new, getting up to speed, or they do know what they're doing, they're just choosing not to do it. But that high performer is such an untapped market for many businesses because, like I said, they're not the squeaky wheel. It's like, oh, don't touch what's already working. It's like, yeah, but you're missing the opportunity of having them become even better, and it lifts the whole team's performance as well. So with that lens in mind, working with the leaders to look at, if you want to lift your bottom line results and lift up your profit and lift up that performance, you've got to have a one size fits one approach for each of your different team members, not a one size fits all, which is often what I am pushing against when I go into an organization, going, you cannot approach each of your performance types with the same frameworks and methodologies, because they're not looking through the same lens when they approach the customer. They're looking through different lenses and they approach it very differently as well. And so it gives you different levers then to do the maths, to get the maths working differently for them.
It's so, you're spot on. What's so fascinating about that is obviously, we're sitting here, the financial year has just ticked over. And what that means is people are either starting to perform against a new financial year budget, or they're just in the process of finalising their budget. And so what I'm hearing a lot from the companies that I work with are their challenges around setting a budget that the board will be happy with. So, as you know, budgets kind of happen one of two ways, and sometimes a messy combination of both. Bottoms up, where you go out and you say to all the departments, tell us how much money you're going to make, how much you're going to spend,
Yes.
and we'll roll that in. Or there's the top down, which is the board says you need to make this. And as I said, it's usually some sort of messy combination of the two. It's very, very interesting because, as you know, the economic climate is extremely volatile and unpredictable at the moment. And so people, what I'm hearing, are having a very hard time with the top line growth, with the sales, whatever they're selling, whether it's widgets or services or what have you. They're having a very, very, very hard time. And so what I'm hearing, particularly from the CFOs that I work with, is that the lever of the top line is almost immovable. And so that puts a lot of pressure on them to figure out, well, how do you then reduce or manage the money outside of things? What I'm wondering as a result of your conversation is, or what I've learned or learning, is that actually there's an opportunity there for the CFO or the CEO to push the head of sales and say, have you broken down your cohort of salespeople into the high performers, as you say, the great performers, the solid performers, and the underperformers? Because what we expect is that 8 to 10% of the performers are likely to be your rainmakers. And so if you're telling me that revenue, if you're telling me that revenue can only stay flat in the new budget, or can only go up with CPI or what have you, what that's telling me is that they're trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach, whereas they could be more better off taking a one-size-fits-one, bifurcate the sales population into the 4 different categories that you've shared. And you've shared some really interesting stats. You said high performers should make up around 8 to 10%, great performers, and that's your rainmakers. Then you've got the 3 levels below. You've got great performers, 30 to 35%, solid performers around 35 to 40%, and then underperformers around less than 5%. I guess the first step would be, hey, tell me where your sales team is at when you categorize them in those 4 different levels. What do those weightings look like? Because that could be a real eye-opener for the head of sales at the start. And then I think a useful executive conversation with respect to budget and forecasts, etc., is, okay, if you've got the cohorts, if you've got that balance, we'll say, right, how are you treating your high performers differently so that they can be the ones that elevate your target from here to here? That's so powerful, Yvonne.
Yes, because if I look at the high performers, they're operating at such a high level anyway. They're self-driven, they're motivated. It's almost like they treat it like they've got a business within a business. And when I sit down with them, the question becomes, how can I help? It's not a case of me telling you what to do. The question becomes, what do you need of me? And 9 out of 10 times, they just need a safe space to talk offline and do a bit of venting. Sometimes, it's a bit of a pressure cooker. But often what I find, and this is why I say to all the leaders I work with, I said, they often don't need you to do anything apart from hold space and listen. Often the sheer art of them just talking through what their challenges are or what's annoying them or where they think their own opportunities are, 9 out of 10 times I hear the high performer go, thanks for that. I've just got an idea of what I need to do next. And I'm like, oh, glad I could be of service. I've just sat here and asked a couple of questions. They don't need for me to give them the tactical, or the strategy of here, do this, do that. 9 out of 10 times they know that. They just need a space to kind of be heard, be listened. Like all of us, we want to be heard and listened. And so that's where I say to the leadership teams, like, get in there, figure out, just hold space for them. And 9 out of 10 times they'll do the work themselves. The fact that they've been listened to is often just, the benefit for them. Also, too, some of them are looking for mentoring. I do say you've got to be careful with the high performance, because often in sales, everyone thinks that the next trajectory is moving into leadership and management. And for some of the top performers I've worked with who've been in industries for 20, 30 years because of the size companies I work with at times, they are not going to be amazing leaders or managers. In fact, I say to the team, do not move them out of that position. They have no desire to be a leader or a manager. They're exceptional at what they do. Ask them what other professional development they're looking for, but staying in that. I said, often they're earning more money anyway than the leadership team, because they're often on commission.
Yeah.
And I said, but you've got to, this is why I say you need a one-size-fits-one approach when it comes to coaching and training, or more coaching than just the broad sweeping broad strokes. And, sometimes they do want to mentor the other team members. Sometimes they don't. And I said, that shouldn't have to be a must for them either. Because I said, they might not be a great trainer, and they might not be able to figure out what their X factor is that has them be so great. And I sometimes don't want them picking around too much, because sometimes they might go, oh, I didn't realize I did that. And then they overthink it. So you've got to, be careful. They're a good race. They're very good for your team as well, by demonstrating what amazing looks like. But for me, the opportunity often sits within the solid and the great performers, because we're measuring it between performance and potential. So solid performers have lots of potential, but they're underperforming. And often it's because they're looking at the great performers and the high performers, and they have imposter syndrome, or they look at them and go, I can't do that. And so therefore they're comparing themselves to someone who is making it look easy, and they look at how hard they're struggling and they go, this isn't for me. I'm never going to be like that. And it's a self-belief issue. They're perfect though for coaching. Getting them to do, I use the GROW. I love using GROW as a coaching framework. It's easy. It's easier to train. It's easy to understand. And so, make sure that the goal is appropriate for their journey, not the great and the high performers, because you're comparing someone who might be doing it for a lot longer, might have some natural talent that does make it easier for them. And so you've got to be careful not to put them in the same race. But that solid performer usually is around 40, can be about 40% of the team. You move that needle up a little bit more for them, and you're moving up a large bulk of your team's performance. And some of the reasons why they might not want to move into great performance is because of some of the behaviors you can sometimes see in your great performers. They're not as committed and motivated 9 out of 10 times as your high performers. And so, but they're doing exceptionally well. They're exceeding expectations often. But they can be a little distracting for sometimes the rest of the team if they're not given some more opportunities to dig deep with their motivation. And because they get their targets really easily, I've got a couple of people in mind, which can't say who, but I know exactly who I've got in my mind. And they get there faster with their results, and then they start to get a bit disruptive in the team because they've already hit their targets and they're not pushing for that next level like the high performer. So they're the ones I often find you've got to really help them figure out what else can they do to get that extra 5 or 10% to move into high performer, because getting them up to that top tier is not as hard as moving a solid performer up to great performer, because they're already there. You just need to get that extra 5 or 10%. But some of the ones I work with, I'm like, oh, you're just distracting the team. Stay in your lane. Let's give you some more to get you really, let's move those KPIs a bit further away for you, so you've got to work a bit harder, because they do make it look a bit effortless compared to some of the other ones. So I really find I focus a lot of my time within that solid and that great, because they're sometimes 75% of the team. That's a huge cohort within an organization that if you can move them up, you're going to move a bulk of your sales up. And that's, really important if we're looking at where to prioritize. And then the underperformers for me are an interesting one. I do think there is a percentage of people that it's just not a good cultural fit. And sometimes I find in organizations, they're investing a lot of time with that very small percent who are draining resources, and they're really impacting the culture of the team. Now, sometimes it's the leadership team aren't prepared to have the courageous conversations, and so therefore don't. And it's like, well, you're now setting a precedence to the whole team that that behaviour is acceptable, and then it's actually costing you opportunity in your other teams, because they're seeing what you're letting occur on whatever frequency it is. And one of the things that we can never quantify is, what is the cost to the business for lost opportunities? And if you've got teams who are seeing that toxic behavior and seeing how it's being acceptable, overtly or not, it then erodes good culture. And that's the thing that we just can't quantify. You can't quantify what's the opportunity, but what we're not actually achieving, because we're letting that behavior continue. So often that's where HR policies are fantastic. It's like, don't shy away, lean in, follow good HR policies, and it's either release them into the wild or put in very good, clear expectations of what is required, and not micromanaging, but using good, good frequency or good coaching cadence. Bring them into the fold, but you definitely don't let them fester. I said you're eroding so much goodwill with your rest of your teams, and that's when sometimes your high performers will go, oh, what am I staying here for? I don't get the same coaching. I don't get the same support. Sure, I'm making good money, but I'll make good money wherever I go because I'm a good high performer. And sometimes it's in the exit interview that businesses go, oh my gosh, now we're hearing about it, and the person's leaving. And that cost of opportunity is, and this is the interesting thing for me, and often CFOs are at battle because they're like, we've got to cut our costs, and training often gets cut quite quickly.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you can cut training, but you might see that cost has come out of your P&L, but what you can't see is what is the impact of cutting training, because that opportunity you can't put in you can forecast, but you can't quantify what the cost of missed opportunity is. And if you've got 75% of your cohort sitting in solid and great performers, and an untapped entity within your high performer, and we've got this squeaky wheel down here in the underperformer, and you're ripping out training or coaching, and let's be honest, most sales managers and leaders never have enough time for coaching or training, unless there's an additional team or an external like myself coming in, because of reports get high priority, putting out fires gets high priority, meetings and everything else gets high priorities apart from coaching and training. It's that, but the missed opportunities is extraordinary. And the businesses that I'm working with right now, yes, the market is tough, but I've got teams who've now come to the end of July, already up from this time last year. Some of them very significantly already. And I've been working with them for months. So for me, it's no surprise. And it's been some adjustment of the team. It's putting in good coaching cadences. It's recognizing who the performers are in the team. And again, coming back to this whole one size fits one approach. That seems to blow the minds out of more leaders that I work with than anything. They're like, oh, we've just been doing this blanket approach. I said, no, it doesn't work. Well, it works in some cases, but you're missing the opportunity of where you can get extraordinary growth.
So even though you say, so I'm not going to challenge you. I'm going to challenge the people watching and listening to this, because you've said it's very hard to measure the cost of opportunity or the opportunity cost. For example, if you were to remove training out of a budget. However, for me, Yvonne, it actually feels like you've broken this down in a really simple way. What you are telling me, what you are telling the listeners, is that the first step you must do is you must know who your cohort is, and you must be able to identify and break them down into those 4 different levels. Because what you're telling me is that, I might have up to 75% of my sales force in that great to solid, in those great to solid bands. And you've said actually the solids are really good to work with. Yeah, it may not be easy, but they're great to work with. There's a lot of potential, usually. And they're the most coachable, as you said. So I go, okay, well, there's that. And then you said the great to high, that movement, is the easiest. Yes,
Mm.
they're a bit distracting, but they are exceeding expectations. And they're actually very easy, especially for someone like you who's so experienced in this space, so easy to tip them into that high caliber.
Mm.
So, what that tells me as a challenge to people listening to this that are saying, oh, it's too hard to calculate the opportunity cost, and oh, it's too hard for me to do this, and it's probably not worth the effort that it's going to take for me to break things down. I would challenge that because, if I think back to my little young bean counter days when we would look at accounts receivable aging and we would calculate
Mm.
a doubtful debt provision. So the expectation that a customer is not going to pay their bills. And what you would do is you would look at the trend and look at that over time and say, okay, well, what does the trend tell us in terms of who is unlikely to pay? Well, my challenge is, well, if you were to look at the trend in your cohort, what
Mm.
those cohorts are selling and historically what those cohorts have sold, I reckon you could calculate that opportunity
Mm.
cost. And that is the money that you are not getting because you are not doing this piece of work. So I think, if I were a CEO, a head of sales, or a CFO, anyone in that C suite, I would be turning straight to my head of sales and saying, okay, you've got a sales force there. Tell me, how do they break down into these 4 categories?
Yep.
What's the percentage? Because that is our opportunity to,
Mm.
to maximize that money in part of the equation. I might
Yes.
have oversimplified it, but it sounds really clear to me.
Yeah. And I always come back to the question of why would you not coach? I find sports, I'm not a massive sporting person, but I know you love a certain footy team. We're never surprised to know that sports teams invest in coaching. Whether they're at the bottom of the ladder and they're wanting to get to the top, of course they've got a coach. They've got a suite of coaches. If they're at the very top of the league, well, they double down even stronger to make sure they stay at the top. And I always say that to leaders and if they're looking at their coaching, is that we would never expect a team, whether it's an underperforming team, a solid team, a great team, or a high-performing team in sports, to not have a coach. Why? Because a coach can see things, and the coach has never usually been the best player. And that's the thing I always put as an analogy for the leaders and managers, because they go, oh, I don't know how to coach my high performance. Like, if you think about sports, now I can't go too deep into sports because I'm not actually a big sporty person, but from my understanding is that most of the time the greatest coaches in the world never came out of being the best player.
Yep.
And they don't stand on the field going, God, I can't kick like Ronaldo, therefore I can't coach Ronaldo. It's like, well, Ronaldo doesn't need you to be the better player than him. He needs you to be the better coach, so to see what he can't see. And that's my whole perspective when I'm working with sales teams. And most people get that, is that we're never surprised in sports to hear about coaching. Yet in business, this is where I say to the teams, it's like, double down. If your team are showing up or not showing up, but they're still on the payroll, they deserve coaching. And I don't approach differently whether they're part-time, full-time, casual, see it as a career, see it as a job. Like, I don't care. I've seen people who've been in a career be shocking. I've seen people who've been part-time be amazing because, they're there for whatever time. I said, I don't care if the label, whether they're part-time, full-time, if they're on your payroll and they're here to do the work, then invest in your people. And that will be always, you'll either figure out that they're not the right fit and then release them gently into the wild with good HR policies. Yeah. I must say that good HR policies every single time, because I remember I did a keynote, would have been about 12 years ago for a very large organization. And I did 3 keynotes back to back, and they just rolled out thousands of people in and out of this keynote. And I remember on the very first one I had a different framework back then, which was, I've adapted it to be with this more aligned with high performance, etc. But I talked about being the underperformers. I called them drifters at that stage, which again, I've relanguaged it over the years. And I remember one guy put his hand up and he goes, so basically what you're saying, we just fire the drifters. And you heard and it was very masculine, a very male dominated industry. And all these guys like, yeah, just get rid of them. And I just heard the language, and I could also see the HR team sitting in the corner gasping for air. And I went, of course, but only with good HR policies. And they side out the HR policies. And I heard some of these guys go, darn, means we can't get rid of them like we would have done in the olden days, as I heard them saying. I said, no, follow your good HR policies. But releasing someone from the business might be the catalyst for change for them, which I hope it is. But more importantly, you've really got to respect the whole team, and keeping underperformers, if they're not prepared to do the work and improve, you've got to look at the better, you've got to look at the whole holistic approach for the whole team. So, yeah, I always love the sporting analogy for coaching, because it's, again, no one would ever be surprised. No one would even question coaching or
Yeah.
training at any of the 4 performance types from a sports point of view. And I see the same for business.
I'm curious about, you've mentioned money, you've mentioned HR policies, you actually use the word motivate. As someone who didn't grow up as a salesperson and was not trained to be a salesperson, I guess I have had in the past a belief that, salespeople are just these cowboys. They just go and sell ice to Eskimos, policies, schmolicies. I just need to make money.
Yeah.
What I've learned over time, and certainly what I've learned from knowing you and from this conversation, you've just reinforced it. Actually, cadence, policy, structure, incredibly important for maximizing sales and therefore that money in part of the equation. But I want to just ask you point blank, is it true what they say that salespeople are primarily motivated by money?
Yes and no. I see it in all 4 of the performance types. Some of them are very driven by money, and great. If they're in a commission business, that might be the motivator that gets them to really show up. I find by the time they're often a high performer, yes, money's important because they're earning a certain level and they want to maintain that because their lifestyle it will be impacted. But that what they've often really understood, and this is why they are high performers and they have repeat business, it often in the industries that I'm in, is the money flows when you look after your customers, when you deeply care about what do your customers need, and you position yourself as a trusted advisor, not a great seller. The money will flow because you get rewarded due to the level of service you provide to your customers. And that's sometimes the disconnect for the great performers. Some of the great performers is the money comes to them because they're good at what they do. But where I often have to coach them on or help them really understand is that they would be even better and make even more by flipping it around and focusing more on delivering better service for their customer, because they know how to sell. And that's often for the business owner. And that's where I find with the great performers is that even from a business owner's point of view, they're like, oh, don't touch them because they're making us lots of money. I said, yes, they are. However, they're churning your clients. Your clients are falling out of the system a bit more because they're not delivering that level of service that your high performers are delivering. They're getting short-term results. They're hitting their targets, exceeding their targets. But if we really look at the data, and you'd love this because you love data, you can see that they're getting a bit more churn, but because they're hitting their numbers, it looks good.
Yes.
But it's like, yeah, but look underneath it. It's like, look underneath, there's the iceberg underneath the water that's bigger than what you see as the tip. Where with the high performers, you're not getting that level of churn from their database because for them, they're looking not just for the quick win or today's sale, they're looking for next year's sale, the year after, the year after. So they've got a longer timeline that they're also focusing on. And so the money flows to them because of that. And yes, I love it when some of the sales team will go, yep, I'm here to make money. I go, great, I'm going to help you make money.
Yeah.
If that's a good motivator, but what I'm going to help you do is, yes, make money, but do it ethically and also be sustainable in the organization. I actually really love it when they're very driven by money because they're good to coach, and then I can help them be a little bit more ethical.
Yeah.
Particularly the great performers. It's when that's you raise a good point actually, because the underperformers, if they're not motivated by money and they're getting, whatever their salary is, that's where the organization has to really get clear on setting expectations and coaching them and putting in, the steps for them to move through to being solid. And sometimes the solid performers aren't performing to their to that next level because of their money beliefs, or they go, oh, I'm uncomfortable focusing on the money.
Yeah.
And so therefore they're not as driven to get out of their comfort zone or work or do the things that are required to get to that great level. And that's difficult because they're great team members, they're solid, they're consistent, they show up, they're often not disruptive to the business. But because and yet they're holding space, and it's like, well, and they're a large cohort that, percentage wise, they're often bigger than the great performers. And it's like, so we've really got to look at what is it that we can do to move them into that great performer. And sometimes the money conversation isn't what's going to do that for them, because it's a turn off for them. So that's why I come back to it's a one size fits one approach. And you've got to know what each individual is motivated by in order to support them, to then help them improve their potential as well. And you can't do that just in big training groups, because
No.
9 out of 10 times people don't know how to run training sessions anyway. No psychological safety in the room. They just, expect everyone to brainstorm and answer rapidly, which, some people, if they're very linear focused, linear processes, can't cope with that. They're introverted. They don't like the extroverts. The extroverts too noisy. It's like, so scrap that. Go, get to know your people individually and see how you can build up their capacity that way. I could talk for days on this.
Yeah, and I want to stay on the money side, but you
Yeah.
have mentioned people and get to know your people and motivate the people so many times. We're going to have to go there, but I will just ask, you've raised a really good point, and you've used some words that, make my mind and my heart sing, and that's making money ethically and sustainably. What I would like to know, though, is, so you've said quite often the great performers are making lots of money, but there's high churn associated with that. And one of the things that distinguishes them from the high performers is the high performers are thinking or selling ethically and sustainably. This tension between short-term and long-term performance is a tension that every single member of the leadership team, CEO, board has to be accountable to, right? Because shareholders, stakeholders want results now, even though they also say they want to be sustainable and ethical and all of those good words, right? What I'd like to know, what distinguishes at a senior leadership level, when you think about all of the clients that you've worked with, all of the companies you've worked with, I am sure you have seen those leaders that are brave enough to look beneath the surface and to go, you know what, those numbers look good, but the churn's too high. We need to take remedial action because this is not aligned with our values, or, we're not taking care of our customers long enough because we are just focused on the churn. What's the difference? What do you see as the difference in leadership between that mindset and, you know what, let's just make the money?
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. It's the culture from the top down for me on that. If there is a CEO or that top level who is get the results at whatever cost, then that comes right through to the sales team. And that's very difficult if I'm trying to build a different culture in their sales team. If at the end of the day that sales manager goes into a meeting and they're like, I don't care about the soft and fluffies, just show me to the bottom. I just want to see the numbers. And then that then becomes the mentality out. It becomes like a boiler room mentality. It's like, get the sale at whatever cost. And that for me is when there's a difference in culture. If I've got a CEO or a business owner who is really seeing that we can get those numbers and still do the right thing for the customers and build a really good culture within the team. It might take a little bit longer if we have to do some reset. But if they see that that's important, then that's the difference. But if ultimately it's coming from the top down, that it's bottom line performance no matter what, usually I don't stay. That's not the culture I'll stay long in anyway, because I value the people in that journey, both because if you want good sales, it's an inside out job. If you want your customers to be purchasing from you, they've got to have an experience with the team that feels great, is great, because they're going to talk about it. And if that's not happening with the culture, because the CEO or the focus is, get the sale at no matter what cost, Well, that's going to show up in your sales team. That's how they're going to close sales. So
Mm,
now sometimes I've been able to have conversations if the CEO or business owner is very rigid in their thinking.
mm,
Um, Usually you get a sense of that when you're going in through your strategy calls anyway.
yeah,
That if sometimes I'll turn, I say, look, I don't think I'm the coach for you or the trainer for you.
yeah.
There's ways I say that, obviously delicately. But occasionally I meet someone, I'm like, gosh, I'm not a good fit because I'm not going to be teaching your teams how to sell for the sake of it, just to get their numbers at
Mm.
the expense of their well-being and at the expense of creating a sustainable business as well. And I think more and more people realize that now. They're churning through too many. There's so much competition in the marketplace now that customers won't put up with a lot of that either.
I think that's so fascinating because you've said it's an inside out job,
Mm.
um, which is quite often dictated or heavily influenced by the culture and tone at the top. But how that translates into the outside world, as i.e., to the customer who's buying your product or service, it's going to make them feel great. They'll have a great experience, and then they will talk about it.
Yeah. Do you know how one of my things when I go on site, which isn't as often now, 99% of my training is still virtual, also because I train national teams.
Yeah.
So, it's I've got all of Australia online. But when I'm on site, I always ask if I can get a cup of coffee in the kitchen or canteen, depending on it.
Yeah.
Canteens are different. If it's a huge organization, they've got, professional caterers. But if it's an office, I go, oh, can I grab a cup of coffee? Now, 9 out of 10 times, it's not because I want a cup of coffee, because I want to see the state of the kitchen. The state of the kitchen will tell me what the culture is like for the team. And I remember one CEO who didn't need to be dealing with me direct. They had enough layers in between, but I got on very well with the CEO and had a long contract with them anyway. And I'd already had a cup of coffee with in my process. And I said to the CEO, I said, let's go for a walk now that I had the contract by that stage. I said, let's go make a cup of coffee. And she goes, oh, no, no, we'll go out to a cafe. I said, no, no, no. I said, come with me. Let's go and have a cup of coffee. And I'd been training her team for a while. And as soon as we went into the kitchen, I said, I want you to have a look. She was on a different floor, so she didn't see this kitchen very often. I said, what are you noticing in the kitchen? She goes, first of all, it's a pigsty. I said, yes. And I said, but go make a cup of coffee. She opened up the drawer and there were no teaspoons. And I said, so you're a call center which has 120 seats. Your teams get 15 minutes off, very short time frames to have a cup of coffee. And, some of them are smoking, so they're stepping outside and going up and down lifts. And I said, so if you've got, let's say, 15 minutes to have a break, you've been talking all day on the phones, and you come in to make a cup of coffee and you can't find a teaspoon, how do you think they're going to be when they come back on the phones to start selling? She said, oh, agitated. I said, there'll be a whole lot of other words that they were thinking as well. And I said, the little things matter. I said, you want your team to perform. You hired me to bring your solids and your high performers up to great performers. And yet for $10, you could go to Kmart, Target, Coles, whatever, and buy 30 spoons. And I said, and that's what's going to matter for them. And it's an interesting conversation. She goes, oh, I so got it. Anyway, so that team transformed quite significantly. And I do attribute teaspoons being one of the
Yeah.
strategies that we put in. But I said, this is an inside out job. I said, if we want your teams to be high performing, be high performing from the inside out, including buy some teaspoons, And, this is why I say it's an inside out job.
Yvonne, this has been such a great conversation, and we do talk for hours, so we could easily do that here. Maybe as a closing question, you have worked with some really successful companies across the course of your real diverse, broad, and successful career. What I would love to know is, what do those most successful companies do well that maybe some of the others not do so well? If you could kind of just summarize and as a closeout, give us that, what would that be?
They track their numbers. They know their numbers and they know their data. And the great combination is when they can take that data and then infuse it with good coaching and training with their team. And that's often the gap, even within sales teams, is those high performers know their numbers. They can tell you to the detail as to what each customer customer value is and the lifetime value of that customer. Those who don't is usually sitting in the solid performers. They're like, oh, I don't want to talk about the numbers. Great performers know their numbers, but they're just not motivated to often move the numbers. But the numbers matter. When they know their data, they know their numbers, they can spot the trends, then it makes it so much easier for me to be able to coach the teams to lift and elevate those numbers. I literally had a customer phone me yesterday who's a new manager for a very successful business that's thriving. And I've been working with the team for a couple of months now. And I said, we need to get more data on your team. We're kind of in the dark as to their conversion rate. So he came back to me and he said, oh, we've finally got some data. We now can track their conversion rate with the volume of calls that they're getting. And he goes, it's really shifted our perception of the team. I said, tell me more. And he goes, we thought that this person was doing better because of the volume of calls, but instead they're doing better. They're actually getting less calls, but they're converting higher. And this person we thought was doing okay, but what we've realized is that they're not converting as much, but they're answering more calls. And he said, we've approached this wrong. Our approach has been not the right strategy for these individuals within one team. And I said, now that we have data, we can approach it differently, but also we now know what mechanisms we need to focus on within their selling cycle and their sales process to elevate it. So now we can figure out that person's answering more calls, but they're not closing. So now we know where we need to focus on in their selling cycle. So for me, data makes all the difference. When I've got data, I can then do something with it, and then I can tailor the approach for each of the individuals. If it's too broad, it's not going to hit the spot for each of the individuals. And it might be that we're not investing the right amount of time in the right part of the person's sales process or conversation. So for me, even though I'm a people person, and all of us are in the business of people, no matter what we sell or et cetera, the data becomes the fuel for me to go, right now, I can supercharge that with some strategies and really customize the approach for the individual. So that's where it's exciting for me if I've got data. Yeah. And great managers and leaders, it's the combination of data and people.
Love that so much.
Yeah,
I mean,
that would
Yvonne,
like you
you've
not
taken
knowing
us
about
on
the
a
data.
journey.
Yeah.
You've taken us on a journey from culture to buying teaspoons and
Yep.
everything in between, but you've really rammed the point home through data and knowing your numbers, and then being able to make better decisions to really take the company and the customers and the communities that you support on a journey that is sustainable and ethical. I mean, there's just been so much from our conversation today. I'm so grateful for your time and your generosity with everything that you've shared. If I am watching this and would love to get in touch, or, how can people hear more from you, speak to you if they want to? What's the best way for people to contact you, Yvonne?
Certainly go to my website, yvonnehilsz.com. I have a great free quiz or a tool for leaders or owners to figure out how confident are their teams at selling, and that's often the starting point, and then we can map out where their cohorts are. So if someone's curious to their team as to how confident they are with their performance and potential, that's often a good starting point to then from there they can start to then go, oh, okay, we've got some opportunity or potentially some honest conversations to have with our team. So yeah, that's a great starting point for the organisation.
You know what? And I think I would recommend everyone watching this to go and do that, because I'm just coming back to this table that I've got on my notepad here. If you can figure out, or when you figure out where your sales team sits, you can make great decisions. You can move everyone up to the high category. And gosh, if you look at what would a 1% movement in from your solid to your great, and what would a 1% movement from your great to your high, and if you could unleash your 1% of high, what would that do to your organization? I reckon for most people listening and watching this, that would actually absolutely be a game changer. So highly recommend everyone go and do that. Yvonne, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so wonderful talking with you. I have learned a huge amount. Can't wait to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Gosh, what a great chat with Yvonne. And that leads us right into our listener question. And remember, if you want to submit a listener question, you can leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and hopefully we'll fit it into a next episode. So today's listener question is from Angela. Hi, Alena. Loved your episode with Julia. Me too. I am doing consulting work with some CEOs, and one of them is looking to hire a new CFO. I thought you might have some good insights based on the real math of business about what you would be looking for in a CFO in 2025. Thank you, and excited to hear your response. Cheers, Angela. Angela, thanks so much for your question. I'm excited that we've got people like you that are supporting CEOs, and you're interested in understanding how a CEO and CFO's relationship can work more effectively and should work. I'll start by saying something that I've actually found myself saying a lot in the last week, and that is we are just talking about humans. Yeah, so we are talking about humans that all have a C in their title, and so they're very senior, and there's a great sense of responsibility that they have in those roles. But I think when it comes to who your CEOs should, or what your CEOs should be thinking about when hiring a new CFO, I think first and foremost we need to recognise that what you are creating is a partnership, or what they are creating is a partnership of humans. And so there needs to be alignment in so many ways. There needs to be challenge, there needs to be leading and guiding and all of those things. But I would say first and foremost, let's just remove the F for a minute of CFO. And we just want to make sure that your CEO is hiring someone that shares your definition of success. Yeah, because we all know, and as someone who works with CFOs day in and day out, the F actually, yes, that's a part of the role, but really they are a business leader. So when you are looking for your right hand, what you want to be looking for is someone that shares your definition of success so that they can be the partner that you as the CEO needs. I thought I'd share a little story from a conversation I had recently with one of my clients and his CEO. The CEO is new, and so they've spent the last few months getting to know each other, and it was my first time meeting the CEO, and we were talking about how that relationship is going between him and the CFO that I work with. And the CEO said to me, Alena, he goes, my client's name's Greg. Alena, I just need to tell you how much I value Greg. Greg has been exceptional. He is more strategic than any CFO that I've known, really blown me out of the water in terms of what he is doing. He said, but what I appreciate most is Greg, in the whole time that I've been here in this organization, Greg is the only person so far that has given me honest feedback. And he said, Alena, and he got a little bit choked up when he said this, so I knew this really meant something. He said, Alena, I need to tell you how much that meant to me, because no one gives me feedback. No one tells me what I need to know and what I cannot see. And he said, so I just value Greg so much for having the courage to share that with me. And he said, because as a result of that, what I know is that I can really trust that Greg's got my back. And he said, don't get me wrong, Greg and I have had our robust conversation where there's been push and pull, but he said, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate a leader who will talk to me honestly and give me feedback when I need it. So I just wanted to share that story with you because that is a human interaction. Yeah. Yes, Greg just so happens to be a CFO, but what we're talking about is a real partnership. And so what you want, what your CEOs want is a partner. They want a CFO that is their true partner and one that understands the interplay of the real math of business so that they understand the duality between the math of, the math side, the money in, money out, and the people side. Yeah, because what you want to create for your companies is a business where people serve people and the math just works. There is one other book that I'll just share with you real quick that describes, the relationship between a CEO and their 2IC really well. In fact, it's called Second in Command, and it's by the Canadian expert Cameron Herold. Second in command is actually about the chief operating officer as a second in command. And look, whether or not it's the COO or the CFO as the right hand, it really depends on the business and what the business needs based on the prevailing conditions of the environment at the time. But what I love about Cameron's book is the way he describes how a CEO looks for their 2IC and how it should make the CEO feel. And it is that one of calm, it is that one of steady, and it's that one of the yin and the yang, the complementary answer. So what I would say, Angela, is it's a great question. And if I could just pick up on what Yvonne just shared with us, we need to think about it as as an individual. It's not a one size fits all CEOs, it's a one size fits one CEO. So, one that shares your definition of success and can be the partner that your CEOs individually need. That is a great question, Angela. Happy to chat further. I would recommend you go out, particularly if your CEOs have chief operating officers, go out, get Cameron's book. It's a really good book. But I hope that's been helpful. I want to say thank you for listening to The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett. If you liked this episode, remember to subscribe for more content and stay on top of The Real Math of Business. I've been Alena Bennett. Thank you for listening.